The way to think of literacy is that it depends on language. So it's best to think of assessing literacy as not just assessing children's ability to read and write, but their understanding of the language. So in my approach to literacy assessment, I would actually do a language and literacy assessment. By language, I mean their level of vocabulary, their understanding about the structures of sentences in their language. Why is that important? If you think of literacy as being able to decode words on one side and be able to comprehend what's written, the comprehension of what is written is dependent on your understanding of the language. So if you want to be able to capture literacy in its entirety, you have to capture, can they read the words, but can they read how the ideas connect in the text? So the approach I would recommend is language and literacy assessment. So much of what we know about learning to read has come from a small group of writing. It's called the alphabetic writing system. It is the Latin-based writing system. So if you think of the alphabet, the number of symbols is smaller. So the way in which a child would approach a small set of symbols to learn it and then start decoding is different from, for example, if you were learning Chinese. Chinese has thousands of symbols. No child is going to learn the entire set for the first 4 or 5 years. You continuously will encounter new symbols as you go into high school. As you're an adult and you do your reading of the newspaper, there will always be a new symbol you might encounter. So you can imagine that the approach to learning to read is very different when you have large number of symbols versus when you have a small number of symbols. So I call it contained symbol set and extended symbol set when it's a larger set. So that impacts the learning that the child is doing, that impacts the teaching that you're doing, that impacts what will you assess. You will not assess all symbols if there are many symbols. You will assess high frequency symbols. You will actually make a decision, what are the symbols essential in the early stages of reading and what are the symbols that will tell you children who know more and can read more. The other difference which you bring up is about language. So what is the way in which language sits on the writing system? So some languages sit on the writing system one-to-one. That means it's a transparent writing system. It captures all the sounds easily on its symbol set. The approach to that kind of learning would be different from if you had a writing system where the writing is not always capturing the spoken sound. English is a good example of it, where one symbol can have 2 sounds, one sound can have 3-4 types of spellings. So it's called an opaque system. So learning to write for a transparent system, learning to read in a transparent system, learning to teach a transparent system is different from learning to write or read or teach an opaque system. So the main thing to keep in mind is that you want to develop program of teaching which is completely close to your language. So if you have a language which has a lot of morphology in it, a lot of inflections, that means you have a base word and you add more units of information to give the full information about something, your approach will be very different. In English, for example, the only time you have a base word and you add something is when it's past tense, then you have the base word and you add the ed. Or if it is a plural, you have the base word and you add the s. So there's not so much of demand in English to have focus on base and additions. But from what I understand about Turkish, it is very rich in having the base and adding. So that then becomes the sort of foundation on which you want to teach the language, the way in which you want children to think of the language, the way in which you want them to read a word and decode the word. That is what will become fundamental to their comprehension. So that's a concrete example, Turkish versus English. Well, my approach has been to turn to storybooks. I believe that storybooks capture the richness of the language. I believe storybooks are able to give you a platform on which to talk with the child, a platform on which to discuss with the child. So I would recommend wherever you can read storybooks together. At home, if you're reading a storybook with the child, that becomes a reason for discussion. That becomes a platform for discussion. In class, if you can bring in storybooks, if you can have a story a day or a story a week, and you think about what the story is telling you, you think about the ambitious words in the story, you think about how can the child retell the story to us. What I think drives my belief in storybooks is not so much just the adult reading the story to the child. It's more about the adult listening to this child retelling the story. It is when the child retells the story that they start exploring the language. They start beginning to think about, I have an audience, how do I communicate well so they know the story? All of these are foundational skills for literacy and for learning. I do believe that all cultures and communities that have been rich in storytelling have begun to lose that tradition. I believe that the way in which our current schooling system is set up, we are not privileging storytelling. My work is to try and give more space in the curriculum for talk. And I'm using stories to bring back talk in the classroom. Not just children listening to the adult, but the adult giving space for the child to talk and express and learn to communicate. So yes, stories have a long history, but do we value it enough in our curriculum? In most contexts, I feel that it's not being valued. My advice to parents is different compared to teachers. So I'll focus on teachers first. The way we are using stories, first of all, is to make sure we identify stories that have a plot. Too many stories for children are flat. They don't have a script that goes up and down. They don't have a narrative structure. But children have a huge appetite for mystery, for magic, for fantasy, for the turn of an event. So what we are looking for in children's literature is excitement, is a variety of emotions. It's a variety of ways in which the central character is trying to do something. So that's one point. So teachers need to be able to pick their stories well. So you may have lots of stories, but you can have good stories and not so good stories. So picking that right story is important. The second thing to keep in mind is that a storybook, in my mind, is more about the language in it than the pictures in it. I think both are very important, but you can have a very well illustrated storybook with very sort of flat language. That for me is not a good storybook. So what you want is good illustrations and you want rich language. So for teachers to be able to look at a storybook and to be able to think of how is the language and the picture interacting and will that excite my children? By excite, I don't mean that it is a circus of different things happening. It means will it grab their attention, get them to engage with the language? So my research work is to try and develop simple ways that teachers can evaluate storybooks. So these are open access materials, so teachers can access these tools and they can make individual decisions, independent decisions by looking at a library of storybooks to say, this fits my requirement. The third thing to keep in mind is that children love to listen to the story again and again. There's no harm in taking a storybook and staying with the storybook for a few days. Right now we are researching using one story for a week. So it's a story a week. The first time we read the story, second time we unpack the story, the third time we synthesize the story. And very soon we ask children to tell back the story. So you need at least a week to do all of those things with one story. So that's another way in which I would ask teachers to think about a storybook. So memory is not the target here so much as surrounding the child with the rich language in the story. Of course, all of that adds to memory, but it also needs to add to the child's excitement about the language so that they spontaneously use the language. They spontaneously become excellent storytellers themselves. The point over here is to surround the child with it, to just make sure that it is an environment of language-rich teaching so that the child can then soak it up. So I don't have data on whether the modality makes a difference, whether it is in a book form or a digital form, what does it do? But the data that I have suggests that whatever the modality, if you don't talk about it, if you don't discuss it, if it's not a shared reading experience, it's not going to be useful to read that story to the child. So even if you're reading it off a tablet, are you having rich conversations around it? That is for me the more critical aspect of it. So you can have a tablet or you can have a book, but are you sharing a conversation with the child? Is there a dialogue? The real teaching component, the most powerful teaching component over there is not whether it's on a tablet or paper, it is the conversation around it. The more children plan the way they're going to communicate something, the more they're becoming masters of their language systems and how they're going to use it to make the maximum communication. So I suppose the main issue over there is the child doesn't know the language of the classroom or is not so proficient in the language of the classroom. The work that we have done suggests that if you don't spend enough time giving them the language foundation, then they're going to struggle. So if it is a Turkish language program and if you have children who are coming into your schools, the main focus would be, do they have a good grip of spoken Turkish? Because spoken Turkish and reading and writing of Turkish, they go hand in hand. The main thing I would ask curriculum developers and policymakers to consider is what percentage of time is being given for spoken Turkish and what percentage of time is being given for reading and writing. If it is 60% reading and writing and 40% spoken Turkish, that's the wrong way around. It needs to start with much more spoken Turkish and much less of the reading and writing. And once the spoken Turkish is up and running, the reading and writing will sit on that. So that would be my sense of how to move forward if your other is a child who doesn't know Turkish, for who Turkish is a language which is their second language or it's a foreign language. You really need to make that bridge between their home language and the school language. Different countries have different language policies, and some countries believe that right from the outset children can be multilingual and they can be provided a curriculum which has more than one language, and they have developed their tradition of having more than one language from grade 1. The point that one has to keep in mind is that children are naturally multilingual. It's not a problem for children to be multilingual. The issue comes when you want them to be multiliterate. That means you want them to be excellent writers and readers in multiple languages. Then you really need to pace the way in which you're going to be teaching this, because otherwise there's going to be this confusion of different writing systems. And as I said, without having a sense of the writing system and the language, you are going to be stuck with a confusing policy if you just borrow it from another country. So you need to think about, is your writing system and language transparent or opaque? Is your writing system contained or extensive? Is your language morphologically rich, like Turkish is? Is the direction of the writing going left to right and right to left? These are all the combinations that will decide what is the cognitive demand of having so many things happening at the same time for the child. And that's what will then decide how will you pace it so that it's not a heavy curriculum for the child who's learning. By ambitious words, I mean words that are just out of reach for children, but if they hear it often enough, they'll pick it up. That's what I would call rich language. And the more children have exposure to rich language, the more their language gets rich. And the more their own language is rich, it will find its way into their writing. So the basic point I'm trying to make is, do not make assumptions that children don't like rich language. They love rich language. Do not oversimplify the books that they read. Do not make the stories you read to them too flat. Ensure that it has excitement, ensure that it has a plot. But most importantly, give your children a language that can get them to be thinking so that they can express. I think the focus of my workshop was to get teachers to think more about storybooks. So it was not so much about storytelling methods for children. It was more about how can you choose a good storybook for children. So my focus was to get teachers to think about story elements, that a story has different kinds of building blocks that make up its full structure. So we were looking at the character, the setting. Is there an initiating event? If there's a problem, what are the attempts? After the attempt, how does it find a resolution? And throughout that story, what are the emotions? What are the mental states that come up? The main message over there was that if a story has these elements, there is a chance that the narrative structure goes up and down, and that is what will grab the child. That is what grabs you and me. When there is a twist and a turn and you want to know what will happen next. Along with the teachers, we were looking at such stories. And then we were looking at, if you have such a story, can you then think about how best can we script the story so that the language is rich? So again, coming back to this idea of, can we have ambitious language in our stories? So we were looking at a story where the teachers were then scripting it, saying, yes, I'll insert ambitious words, ambitious language as I narrate the simple story. So my work with teachers is to make them more critical about children's storybooks and to make them also people who will use storybooks for rich language, who will use storybooks for questioning and getting and eliciting answers and then demonstrating how best to engage with the story. Finally, I'd like my workshops to be able to get teachers to stop their part of the storytelling and become good listeners of children's retelling of stories. Because for the full use of the storytelling as a technique, you need the child to become a reteller of the story and the teacher as a listener of that story, because it's in the give and the take of the child and the teacher that the language experience comes alive. And then that is what will start reflecting in their writing, because now they have the confidence to use longer sentences, unusual words, their own descriptions. Now you're beginning to hear the voice of the child. Often I've heard teachers tell me, and also myself working with children, often they will come with a view of the world which will surprise you. For example, there was a time when I had a question in a curriculum I was writing with teachers. The question was, what is smaller than an ant? And many of the people in the room said, this is a very difficult question. How will children know what's smaller than an ant? They don't know bacteria, they don't know amoeba, they don't know parasites. They can't answer this. I said, why don't we go and ask the children? So what is smaller than an ant? And they say sugar, mustard seed. So children are thinking all the time and they are giving us answers which sometimes we discount. Yes, teachers will constantly learn from children if they give the space for children to talk. Yes, this is a part of school climate, right? It's a part of the classroom climate where you're allowing for the child's voice. There will have to be space in the curriculum for didactic teaching, and there is space for this kind of an interpersonal lesson. The point I'm making is not for the entire school day to be about interpersonal lesson. There will have to be lessons which are didactic. There will have to be where children hear, teacher teaches, and they have to just settle down and practice. All of those structures of teaching and pedagogy which are Socratic in nature, question and answer, they all have space in the curriculum, in the school day. The point I'm making is that the communicative, rich talk aspect of it, I don't see it enough in classrooms. And I think we need to specifically, in a targeted way, say we are going to timetable it in. We are going to say half an hour is for spoken language. And that spoken language, we are going to again structure it and say that it is about a story and it's about retelling and telling. That is what I'm talking about.